The DCEU sucked. Time to rip the band-aid off. I know there's a lot of Zack Snyder fans who like to live in an imaginary world where only his extended cuts exist, but in actual reality, the DCEU was a failure. There's a lot of reasons for the collapse of this cinematic universe, but in the end, I'm honestly glad it's gone and that we get to start over. In my humble opinion, the DCEU as a whole was a poor representation of DC Comics, which houses some of the most iconic storylines in the history of fiction. To have this vast, expansive pool of comic material to adapt and draw inspiration from, only to give us films like Suicide Squad and Joss Whedon's Justice League, is inexcusable. Now, I have some tentative excitement for the rebooted DCU, as I've enjoyed a vast majority of James Gunn's film work, especially his comic book movies, but I still have some concerns with the studio itself. So let's talk about it. James Gunn is awesome. Guardians of the Galaxy is my favorite MCU movie, and honestly is just one of my favorite films in general. It is colorful, has great action, perfect comedic timing, and most importantly, has heart to it. Guardians Part 2 is an enjoyable sequel that hits many of the same notes, and Guardians Part 3 is a super emotional and satisfying send-off for this lovable group of misfits that James Gunn really brought to life. And as far as Gunn's DCEU outings, I really enjoyed both The Suicide Squad and Peacemaker. I wouldn't say they were as good as Guardians of the Galaxy, but they were both easily some of the best DCEU content that we got. And I think the big thing to note with all of these successful James Gunn-headed projects is that he's primarily doing this with no A-listers. The Suicide Squad, and especially the Guardians, are primarily made up of B-tier and C-tier level comic book characters. There's no Batman, Superman, or Spider-Man level names here. So the fact that Gunn was able to make us care so much and garner the public's interest in some of these rather obscure characters gives me a lot of hope for what he can do with an entire cinematic universe, and the big name characters once he gets his hands on them. But while I think James Gunn is a great choice to creatively spearhead the DCU, my biggest fear is that, at the end of the day, Warner Brothers is still making the final decisions. I know that James Gunn will get to add his flair to a lot of these projects, even the ones he isn't directing, but Warner Brothers as a studio just has such a track record for making some really head-scratching decisions and not letting directors cook. So I just can't have complete faith in the studio to not get too involved. I want to believe, but when I see the studio give us not one but two Ezra Millers in a Flash movie after all of his controversy, rush to make a Batman v Superman movie just to compete with Civil War, completely butcher Snyder's Justice League after he was forced to step away due to a personal tragedy, throw 30 random popular songs in Suicide Squad for no reason, it makes it really hard to trust them. I mean, the list of bad decisions just goes on and on. I'm personally taking a tentatively optimistic approach to the DCU because while I trust James Gunn, I do not trust Warner Brothers as a studio. And they're going to have to earn my trust with a few successful installments before I buy into this new cinematic world fully. One of my biggest concerns is the Elseworld DC movies. As much as I did enjoy Joker and The Batman, and look forward to seeing their respective sequels, this does feel a bit like Warner Brothers wanting to have their cake and eat it too. Both Joker and The Batman were huge financial successes, so they of course want to make sequels to cash in on the fan interest. But I do think having multiple timelines and storylines going on simultaneously is going to run the risk of confusing casual fans. Yes, the hardcore fans are not going to care and will understand what's going on, but if you really want to bring in the big bucks, you need the casual audience. So I just worry about having two Batmans in two different continuities. At least as things stand now, the Batman 2 and Batman Brave and the Bold are slated to drop within a year or so of each other, and outside of just being confusing for some fans, I also think this runs the risk of creatively stifling both Batman films to a certain degree, as you're going to want to make them as different as possible, which means needing to use different villains, different love interests, different storylines, and I can see a world where James Gunn and Matt Reeves potentially clash if they both want to adapt a similar storyline or use the same villain. Now, thankfully Batman does have a massive rogues gallery of villains to work with, so they definitely could make two Batmen work. but I think this is certainly not optimal circumstances for making a new Batman. Now that I've addressed some of my big looming concerns with the DCU, I'll list some of the things I'm hoping to see in the new cinematic world. And the most important thing for me is that we take our time. I still think the DCEU's biggest issue was trying to fast track everything. What I'm really hoping for is a self-contained Superman movie that gives us a great portrayal of the character and really focuses on making Clark an interesting and complex individual. I'll be honest, to me, Superman can be a little bland and dry sometimes, so I'm hoping that this is James Gunn's primary concern. What I've heard about the project so far sounds like we might be heading into the right direction. I like that he's already going to be established as Superman, and it's not solely an origin story like Man of Steel was, and that it promises to showcase Clark's struggle to reconcile his Kryptonian heritage with his new human life with his adoptive family. And my hope is that in Clark's desire and struggle to learn what it means to be human, he ends up developing his ideals on hope and justice, and his love for the American way. World building is important for sure, but it should happen slowly early on. It's just like building a house. You can have all these great plans and ideas for how you want to design and decorate your house, but if the foundation isn't solid, none of these things matter. And in this case, Superman is the foundation of the DCU. This is our starting point, and we need Superman to grab our attention. If the DCU can do this with the first phase, giving us self-contained stories and fun, interesting characters, with the world building being secondary to these things, I think it can succeed. And I know this might sound counterintuitive, as you need to world build in order to have a cinematic universe, but if we as an audience don't care about the characters, then the world doesn't matter. There's quite a few MCU characters that fans didn't care that much about, but the foundational characters, like Tony and Cap, had immense love from the fans. And this is because their journeys started with rather self-contained, personal stories that laid the groundwork for further development. And as we've seen, when you remove these pillar characters who actually had proper development, like Iron Man, well, the MCU as a whole has crumbled a bit. I also think it's going to be key for the DCU to not be afraid to take a chance on some obscure characters. And the rumblings about Creature Commandos and Booster Gold already have my interest piqued in this regard, but in general, I think we've seen a lot of the A-list characters from DC Comics on the big screen in the past decade, so I think leading with a few C-listers or lesser known characters could be freeing in a way, as there isn't a pre-established version of the character that you're competing with or trying to one-up. And since this has been a strength for James Gunn in the past, I think it's important to take advantage of this, and give the DCU a unique vibe that is much different from the DCEU and the DC Elseworld projects. Especially given that we're starting with the Superman film, which is already exactly how the DCEU began. But this being said, I also think it's important to not overextend yourself in Phase 1. It's okay to have a lot of characters in play in different locations / planets, but let's not really focus on interconnecting them yet. Let the Lantern show have a unique setting and don't worry about linking it to Superman's story in Metropolis. Stitching things together should be happening once fans are already introduced to these iterations of the characters and have a chance to establish connections with them. Because I know a lot of people who feel the way I do, and if we get fed this expansive universe where you need to see 15 movies and shows just to understand what's happening from the jump, we're probably going to check out and lose interest, because this universe needs to gain us as fans first before we buy into it. Assuming that I had complete fan investment from the start was perhaps the biggest mistake of the DCEU. All in all, there's a lot of reasons for comic book fans to be excited for the DCU to debut in 2025, but given the track record of Warner Brothers as a film studio, there's also some reasons to worry. I am going to reserve judgment until we get James Gunn's Superman film, but for now, I remain cautiously optimistic. And I hope everyone learns from the DCEU, because one who does not learn from their mistakes is doomed to repeat them. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, please feel free to drop a like or subscribe, and let me know how you're feeling about the DCU. Are you excited? Do you think it's going to fail spectacularly? Who are some of the characters you're hoping to see introduced? Until next time, peace.